In 1976, Sacramento, California, became the site of the first major attack later linked to the Golden State Killer. This was not just a single case. It was the beginning of a series that, over several years, covered Northern and Central California, turned the city and the entire state into a zone of constant fear, and left dozens of victims. In that house, in 1976, an unknown criminal broke in at night, tied up the homeowners, threatened them with weapons, and raped the woman while the man, tied and unable to escape, heard everything. He did not know who it was, but he became one of the first figures in history who, years later, received a name: Golden State Killer. At that time, it was not yet known, but the system had already recorded DNA, blood, and other traces that later would become the key to his capture. It was in those years, in Sacramento, then in Oakland and other cities, that the person who later was called the East Area Rapist, then the original Night Stalker, and finally the Golden State Killer, began to operate. He chose houses, entered at night, tied people up, threatened them, raped them, and in some cases killed them. He knew how to minimize risk. He knew how to work in residential areas. He understood how to avoid leaving a trace. But he was not perfect. In the 1970s and 1980s, fear moved around him. But there was no name, no face, no court. Decades later, after the attacks suddenly stopped in the mid-1980s and the case turned cold, a method that became a turning point emerged in the 2010s: forensic genetic genealogy. DNA found at the crime scenes was uploaded to the genealogy database GEDmatch. The system showed distant relatives of the criminal. Investigators built a genealogical tree, narrowed the circle, and reached Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer who lived in a suburb of Sacramento in 2018. In April 2018, they arrested him in his home. In June 2020, he pleaded guilty to 13 murders and a number of rapes and other serious crimes committed in the 1970s and 1980s. The court sentenced him to 11 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional terms, effectively guaranteeing that he would die in prison. That is how it all began in 1976 in Sacramento, California, how it developed over decades, and how it ended in prison in 2020. The Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, was punished more than 40 years later, thanks to DNA and genealogy sites. For those years, life in California was lived in constant fear. At night, an unknown predator began to break into people's homes. At first, he was called the East Area Rapist, the rapist from the eastern part of Sacramento. He crept up to houses, waited until the people were asleep, then broke in, tied the victims, threatened them with weapons, and tortured them for hours. He often attacked couples. He tied the man and left him in one room, while in the other, he raped the woman, sometimes forcing the man to hear everything that was happening. In some homes, he left only fear and humiliation. In others, blood and corpses. Later, when similar crimes began to occur in other parts of the state, he was called the original Night Stalker. And years later, the press fixed the name Golden State Killer on him, the killer of the Golden State. The investigation dragged on for decades. The police of different counties saw separate cases, a series of rapes here, a series of murders there. It was not always clear that all of this was one and the same person. Over time, investigators linked the episodes into a single chain. There were dozens of victims, at least 13 proven murders, more than 50 to 60 rapes, and hundreds of armed assaults and house robberies. But the name of the criminal remained an empty place in the reports. By the mid-1980s, the attacks suddenly stopped. No new episodes, no new clues. As if the man who had terrorized the entire state for years simply disappeared. The cases began to cool. The classic status of a cold case appeared, an unpunished crime in which all obvious versions have been exhausted and the threads break one after another. For the families of the dead and raped, this meant one thing: they would probably never know who destroyed their lives. Nevertheless, the investigation had one anchor: DNA. On the crime scenes, there were biological traces: blood, semen, other samples. In later years, they built a DNA profile of the person who committed these crimes based on them. The problem was different. This profile did not match any record in the national databases. The criminal had never provided DNA in other cases, had not been imprisoned on serious charges, and had not entered the registers where his genetic fingerprint could be compared. It seemed that he would remain just a set of numbers and letters in a laboratory report. The situation changed in the 2010s, when home DNA tests and genealogy sites began to spread massively in the world. Millions of people bought kits, spit into vials, sent samples by mail, and uploaded their DNA profiles to online databases to find out where their ancestors came from and to find distant relatives. One of these services was GEDmatch, where users voluntarily posted their genetic data. And one of those who did had a common ancestor with the man known throughout the country as the Golden State Killer. Investigators decided to use a method that was then considered almost revolutionary: forensic genetic genealogy. They took an anonymized DNA profile of the killer from old evidence and uploaded it to a genealogy database, as if it was a regular user's profile. The system did not say, "Here is his name," but it showed something else. There are people in the database who have partial matches with this profile, distant relatives, perhaps second or third cousins. This meant that somewhere in their genealogy, there was a common ancestor with the criminal. Then began detective work at the level of family history. Geneticists and investigators built huge genealogical trees, going back to the 19th century, tracking family branches, marriages, moves. They gradually narrowed the circle, excluding those who did not fit by age, place of residence, or gender. Finally, a small group of men remained who could match that DNA profile and lived where many attacks had taken place for years. Among these people was a former police officer, Joseph James DeAngelo. DeAngelo's biography fit perfectly into the puzzle. He served in the police in the same regions of California where the criminal operated. He knew the areas, knew how the investigation worked, understood how to avoid checks. After leaving the police, he worked in a store, then lived a quiet life in a suburb. Outside, an ordinary old man. Inside, a potential serial monster who no one suspected. For final proof, DNA from the database alone was not enough. A fresh sample taken from DeAngelo himself was needed. The investigators began secret surveillance. They did not approach him directly, did not ask for a test. Instead, they waited until he left something that could be quietly taken. At some point, he threw an object in the trash. According to open sources, it could have been a napkin, a paper cup, or some other disposable object on which traces of his saliva remained. This object got into the laboratory. From it, they extracted DNA and compared it with the same old profile from the evidence, and got a complete match. The markers in key DNA regions matched those found on materials from murder and rape scenes. In April 2018, the police came to the house of Joseph James DeAngelo and arrested him. At that time, he was about 72 years old. For neighbors, this was a shock. A quiet old man, whom they saw every day, turned out to be a man who for decades had been sought as one of the most brutal criminals in the history of the state. For the relatives of the victims, this was a moment they had waited for most of their lives. The man who, as they thought, disappeared in the 80s, was alive, and all this time lived among ordinary people. Then followed months of legal procedures and interviews. The suspects gathered cases from different counties of California: murders, sexual crimes, attacks. To avoid the death penalty, he agreed to a deal. In June 2020, he officially pleaded guilty to 13 murders and a number of rapes and other serious crimes committed in the 1970s and 1980s. Prosecutors from 6 counties joined together and supported the agreement. Instead of the death penalty, several life sentences without the right to parole. The court sentenced Joseph James DeAngelo to 11 life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional terms, effectively guaranteeing that he would die in prison. During the hearings, the judge read in detail the terrifying details of his crimes, and surviving victims and relatives of the deceased spoke with statements, telling how those nights destroyed their lives. After decades of silent fear, doubts, and helplessness, they finally saw the man who stood behind this nightmare, in handcuffs, under guard, with no chance of release. The story of the Golden State Killer became a turning point, not only for this specific case, but also for the entire approach to investigating crimes. It showed that the perfect crime can stop being perfect after 30 to 40 years, when technology catches up with the criminal. Any drop of blood, any biological trace left in the 1970s turned into a genetic trap that only closed in the 2010s, when the criminal's distant relatives voluntarily uploaded their DNA to the internet. He did not need to give a test himself. It was enough for someone from his family to do it. But at the same time, this case also raised another scary question. How far can the use of DNA from commercial genealogy databases go? Some saw in it the triumph of justice and an instrument that finally allows us to close decades-old cold cases, returning names to victims and punishing those who thought they were outside the law. Others began to talk about risks, that someone's private genetic information could one day become the key not only to solving a crime, but also to family secrets that no one wants to know. In the case of the Golden State Killer, the debate about genetic privacy flared up especially brightly, because it was the genealogy site that became the bridge by which the investigation came to a man who had managed to hide from justice for decades. This story is scary precisely because, for many years, it was unfinished. Victims lived with the thought that their tormentor was somewhere free, the relatives of the dead, that the one who deprived their loved ones of life would not answer for what he had done. And the criminal himself, perhaps, thought that he had won, that time and the change of epochs had reliably hidden his traces. But one small fragment of DNA, preserved on an old piece of evidence, turned out to be stronger than decades. And one morning in the quiet American suburb, police cars finally came, for a man whom the world had long called an unnamed monster, and then finally named by name: the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo.